Abolition is for Everybody is a podcast that tackles the sometimes difficult conversations around prison abolition.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Taina.
And I'm Lee.
We're excited to talk about the possibilities and realities of abolition in today's world with you. Join us for a friendly talk, sometimes with guest experts. Just a reminder, friends, in this episode and every episode, we talk about very sensitive and often personal issues. Take care of you. Today we're talking about disability and disability justice. A disabled person is anyone with a non-conforming body or mind. It's basically assessed on a diagnostic level as someone who has difficulty interacting with the world. Disability justice arises from the protection of people in that class, and that justice is almost entirely created by them and for them, has been a work in process for hundreds of years. Disability justice has been a major force in most massive liberations that we have seen in the last 100 years. And today we're talking about how that correlates to abolition. Yeah, I think with this disability episode, because like we've mentioned, it's such a wide-ranging topic, one of the things we really want to focus on is how it directly corresponds to institutionalization and prisons, and how we can use the frameworks of disability justice to set up abolition work, instead of going too deep into the history of disability justice altogether, even though it is fascinating and all connects. But yeah, I think that was the goal.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and I think the more that we can get into like cross collaboration with this process and having more voices at the table, the better off we're going to be. Because I know that we talk about here at IJ, those that are closest to the issues are closest to the solutions, right? And when I first got incarcerated and I was going through that process, I had a lot of things going on, not only in my personal trauma, but also I was very sad or depressed. I didn't understand the process that was going on around me because I was at such a young age. Eventually, when I went into county jail, the first thing they want to do is start to medicate you. There's nothing else there, but they're just here's some medication. And so I don't know how your experience was, Raw, but that was the solution for anything within the institutional setting. And I saw it in a large swath of how they dealt with folks inside. It was just here's medication, or we're going to isolate you and lock you up and put you in, administrative segregation where you're away from everybody else.
Definitely. And they take a lot of people off medication that they've been on for a very long time. And then one of the very first parts of the process in prison is assessing your ableism, your ability, I guess, your able-bodiedness, in order to see what programs you're best fit for, So the very first thing they do, really, even before they fully assess your mental health or well-being, or certainly no one looks over your case or anything like that, but they just want to know, can you lift things? Can you carry things? Can you squat? Can you lift? It's a weird system that kind of fixates on an abled body, which is particularly ironic when you realize that disabled people are more likely to be arrested and able-bodied people who go into prison are more likely to leave disabled. It's just this weird circular spiral thing.
I think one of the things that really stood out to me when you were talking, Raw, is, the system is designed for what can you do for it, not what can it do for you. And I think that's the basis of abolition. How can they capitalize off of you? How can they make money off of you? And when you come in, you're assessed that way, right? You talked a little bit about them doing a screening process of lifting things, moving things. And so it's really not geared towards any type of health. And I think it was Reagan who first shut down a lot of the mental health facilities and institutions or whatever, and started just compile them or putting everybody in prison. And, while I was in there, it was very sad and disheartening and even overwhelming most of the time about how folks were treated.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for us to talk about disability justice when we're talking about abolition overall, because so many folks are impacted by having some form of a disability, mental or physical disability, and because the world is not designed for folks who are a little bit different, and we don't do a good job of caring for folks, they are more likely to be criminalized for, maybe behaviors that seem like they're outside of the norm. So instead of getting treatment or care for, a different ability that they may have, they are criminalized. They get sent to prison. I think the statistics are that about half of folks who are killed by police have some kind of disability, which is a really shocking statistic. I know something that we also want to talk about is how not only how people with disabilities get caught up in the system, but how prison is also a debilitating experience. For sure, it will have an impact on your mental health, likely also have an impact on the mental health of your loved ones, like it did for me when I had a loved one inside. But for so many folks, also have an impact on your physical health and your physical ability. So, yeah, I'd love to dive into that a little bit more. I can share for me, having a loved one in prison resulted in me getting a diagnosis of depression and PTSD. And I think a lot of times folks will associate PTSD with people who are survivors of war and things like that. Maybe folks might assume that would happen for the person in prison, but not for their loved ones. But, it really did change my whole life to have someone in prison. The amount of stigma and shame and judgment that I faced, stressed out about finances and am I going to be able to pay to visit this weekend, constant vigilance with my cell phone. I need to always have my cell phone with me in case they're calling me and, I don't want to miss their call because I can't call back. And just, the loneliness and the isolation and, the hopelessness that comes with, being separated from somebody who you care about. And then even, afterwards, even after they were released, I didn't think that this is something I would experience, but I started experiencing flashbacks. I imagined being in the visiting room. I imagined, my loved one being taken away by the cops. And it was, just a really traumatizing experience, for me. And I feel like my experience is even still so small in the world, especially for folks who have actually been in prison themselves. So yeah, I think when we're talking about the need to abolish prisons, we also need to be talking about the impact that prisons have on our mental health, on our, physical well-being, and the way that they just exacerbate issues that are already in existence.
Yeah, and I think loved ones definitely suffer the traumas of prison, especially once we're outside through that reentry process and parole, where you become under supervision because you love somebody who is under supervision. It kind of made actually parole a little bit more exhausting to me than prison was, knowing that my mom's car could be stopped and searched at any given time. And, they raided my house at 3:00 in the morning and pulled her out in her nightgown. And it's one of those things where, they apologized and whatnot afterwards. But I'm like, there's an 8-year-old girl without shoes on who was dragged out of her house at 3 a.m. You can't apologize that away. That's going to do something to the people around you. And then for myself, I left prison physically disabled. Again, a podcast so people can't see, but most of the time I walk with a cane. It isn't an everyday thing anymore, thanks to several surgeries. But I went through the fire camp program. In the women's facilities during the training, the resources aren't necessarily available to you to effectively and healthily train. So you're being underfed. The shoes I was exercising with didn't have the soles attached. The sweatpants and sweatshirts you're in are ridiculous in Riverside in the summer months, which is when we were exercising for hours a day. And all of those things contribute. In my case, it was the shoes. I slipped off boxes and dislocated and then fractured my hip, which was left untreated through prison, which eventually led to clots, which led to strokes. So it's been a journey of disability from prison alone. Yeah, so definitely things like this happen. They are not rare and unusual cases, unfortunately. And I think, it's disheartening to know that just being disabled makes you more likely to be in the system again.
Yeah, I mean, the system is just like, it's really set up for them to continue to like oppress and take away folks' rights. And, we talk about people with disabilities or different abilities than other folks. And, going through my experience personally, I was still trying to just figure out life, and I was just trying to figure out like who I was. And I wasn't getting great examples from the quote unquote caretakers or the guards or the wards or the administration, because I saw like the way that they treated not only me, but the folks that were around me. And any type of disruption out of their social norms of what they wanted, or you stepping out of line or crying out for attention or any of that, was just met with force and fear and oppression, which just continued to exacerbate, the issues that I was personally dealing with, which was, like you talked about, the loneliness, the sadness. And then on the other end of it, my family, they just didn't know like what was going on with me. They couldn't, where was the spark that the boy that they remembered that went into the system, where had that gone the few years before I'd gone in? And then like, why wasn't it being reignited once I was in there? I thought the place was designed for help. And so it's a tough road to walk inside there. And I can only imagine, like Taina was explaining, what she went through when her loved one was incarcerated too. And so, where do we go, right? How do we start to clean up the mess that has been made? I think is the $1 million question.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great question, right? And that's along the lines that I was thinking when you were talking was, where does this all start? Some folks know that in another life, I was a teacher. So I taught special education for a year. I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th graders who all had different learning disabilities. And I just remember thinking, like, this world is not set up for these kids. I was so afraid. I mean, first of all, they were all students of color. They were all low income. And they, their disability made things difficult for them to operate in the world. They had a hard time counting. So I could imagine it would be difficult for them to find a job, even as a cashier, and, counting money and things like that would be a challenge for them. And in the capitalist world that we live in, like, everything is like measured by your productivity. So my fear was they're not going to be able to find employment, and therefore they're going to resort to measures that are, probably gonna end up with them being incarcerated. And I just think, first of all, like, if we want to like just really zoom on my situation, I was a 23-year-old person when I was teaching these 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. I was not much older than most of them. I was not taller than most of them. I think only 2 of my students were shorter than me. And here I am, like, I'm the person who's supposed to like put them on the right path for like success. And, I wasn't put on the right path for success. I didn't get enough training to, help them like work through their disabilities. And I think that that's just so true with so many, students, with so many kids. Like, they don't get the supports and the accommodations that they need in order to be successful in the classroom if they have learning disabilities. And then, like, there really isn't space for folks with different learning styles in the world. In the absence of these supports, folks end up either harming themselves or harming others and getting caught up in this like, criminal punishment system. And I don't know, when I think about abolition, I think about a world where we have supports and accommodations for students with learning disabilities, where they're, the way that they differentiate from the norm is not seen as something negative, but there's like a place for them, to exist and to thrive, like, in the world, even with their abilities being different from a lot of other people in society, that there is a path for success and for fulfillment for them. And I just really think that this doesn't exist in the world that we have now, because we focus so much on just, like the after effect. Like, if somebody ends up stealing because, they're in poverty, okay, now we're going to send you to prison. But what about like the years or decades before that led up to a person feeling like this was the only option that they had? I don't know. That's just kind of where my mind goes when I think, Lee, of what you were saying when you were talking about how your family was like, well, what happened to this young boy? I was also thinking like, well, where, could we have intervened with you as a young boy so you wouldn't have ended up in that situation in the first place?
This is, I think, when we started putting together this episode where we started to struggle, because this is where like disability justice history comes so significantly into play. One, just remembering how new the nation's understanding of disability is. The Americans with Disability Act is 30 years old. I'm older than it. And so it's very, very new. And we still haven't worked out problems within that system. Like if you're on SSI, you're limited in what you can make. You can't hold a regular job. You can't get married because then that person becomes your caretaker and you're no longer eligible for those benefits. So that's the reality of like where we live right now in today, 2021. If you just rewind not too far, we didn't abolish the ugly laws till 1974, which is like basically a law that said if you disrupt our like visual space with scars, disability, mutations, anything like that, you're arrested and put in jail. And it only really went away because a lawyer argued that you would have to like define this person as ugly in order to convict them. And people realized just how ridiculous it was. And it kind of went away there. But 1974 was not that long ago. These are all very recent things. So when we talk about prison not having a space for disability and schools not having a space for disability, it's really the world that doesn't have a space for disability, which brings us back to disability justice and how leaders in that world have created so many systems of care that now when we start talking about abolition, like a lot of these systems are really translatable. Like Mia Mingus has something called pod mapping, where you consciously come up with resources in your life that you would go to if you had been harmed or if you had created or caused harm. And you like sit down and you make a real list of people in your life who will hold you accountable or who will assist you, as well as resources. And I think that's one of those things that like everybody could do. And it would show us how many gaps there are in our social services and local services and things like that. Like who would you really go to if you did something that was a problem, and how would you resolve that? That was our history lesson for the day.
Yeah. No, I love it though, because look, it opens up so many other like opportunities for us to like just examine ourselves, look within to be able to kind of change the things that are around us. Like, and I know those are difficult lists to make. I know when I was going through, my battle with my addiction to marijuana when I was a younger kid, through the 12 steps, you start to go through these processes of writing down the people that you've harmed or the things that you believed and had. And I think I've read somewhere about, to start with abolition, you got to start with your abolition of your thoughts and your ways of thinking, or the ways that you're showing up in your community. And how do we kind of adjust that into our, maybe our implicit biases or our biases against, the folks that are different from us, and our frustrations or short-sightedness, or even my being impatient with folks. And I think that's a really good place to kind of start to really unpack how I show up in my community and how I show up in my world, and what I can do to change that and make it better. And being incarcerated and going through that system, like my empathy like went off the rails, where I would have moments where it literally would just bring tears to my eyes to see how folks were treated, and even by us that were in there, by the incarcerated folks, and how they treated people differently, because it was something that was so ingrained, I think, in our communities, and how we were brought up to capitalize off of the differences of folks instead of to, highlight them and to uplift them. And for me, that's where it really started to change, is I started to like adopt the lifestyle and the way of thinking of uplifting the folks that were around me, and not necessarily like the crabs in the bucket type mentality where I was pulling folks down, and it really was one of those 180-degree changes that I think that helped me personally. And, we talk about how our society and our communities aren't really set up for that. And, there's pockets of it. Obviously, we're talking about it, right? There's pockets of it. And how do we continue to grow and to highlight those pockets of folks that recognize that and that want to uplift their fellow community members, regardless of the differences.
Yeah, I love that, Lee. And when you were talking, it made me think about in our own like abolitionist organizing, like how are we ensuring that we're not like replicating systems of ableism, and how are we working to make sure that we are inclusive of everyone? And it's hard, something that we started doing recently, thanks to Raw, like with our staff meetings, is now we turn on the captions if that's, easier for some folks on the team. And there's just, so many things I feel like that we could be doing more of, that some folks like already do a really great job of like providing ASL interpretation for their events and things like that. If you have an in-person event, like making sure that, there are ramps if people have mobility issues. I'm even thinking of our office where we have a really weird elevator situation, and we like most folks have to take the stairs, and that's not great for everyone. So yeah, it's also calling me to be more conscious of what are like our own blind spots in doing this work, and how can we lead, like you were talking about, like shifting your mindset. It made me think about shifting my own mindset and trying to be more aware of like which folks would find this difficult to participate in because we don't have the accommodations that we need to make everybody feel welcome. So yeah, that's just what was coming to my mind in thinking through what it means to be seeing ourselves as an abolitionist, to be doing this work. And, it's true, like the systems definitely need to change. The systems are messing up in a real way. But I think that there's also things that we can be doing on an individual level to make more accommodations for folks, or, to your point, Rod, to make accommodations for ourselves and to set up our pods and make sure that, we are in situations where we feel supported and uplifted for, whatever it is that we may be going through.
Yeah. When Lee made the crab metaphor, I was thinking about there's a meme about how, yes, crabs will pull each other down to try to get out of the bucket, but like, who put them in the bucket?
Right.
And why is there a bucket?
Right.
Let's talk about the bucket. Let's talk about that system that kind of puts us in a position where we default to that, even in this. I mean, we're in yet another time where disabled people are kind of under attack with COVID and all of this stuff going on, where, I mean, I've just stopped listening to the news because every fourth sentence is how does it really matter if I die? Like she was already sick, she was already, and you have to hear these things all the time. I'm in a pretty good mental place, but I have a lot of friends who are still struggling with diagnosis and struggling with pain. And I just think like this can't be good for your mental health either, to just have people be so reckless with your life so consistently. And I know there are nuances to, not being vaccinated and not being masked, but like there's a very real measurable reality to vaccinations for like disabled people where it's less effective. So I really, really count on the people around me taking care of themselves, and social justice movements, we need on-site people to do things. But at the same time, we also need to acknowledge that us being all together in person during these times is rough for the disabled people in our community. We either step back and we don't get to be involved, or we take a chance on our actual lives. It's just, to your point, like, it's just, there's no perfect way, it's a lot of it is still new. A lot of these disabilities are just getting names, and a lot of people struggle with even calling themselves disabled, because of ableism for so many years and acknowledging things. Like I have a cane, so people are like, oh, pretty straightforward, disabled. But I'm also, chronically ill, and you can't see that, but it's actually more disabling than a slight limp. Yeah, I don't know. We're still struggling with so many things. I think that's an important part of the conversation, to just remind people that like really no one's doing it perfectly. We're all just trying to keep it in mind all the time, and think about that bucket as much as possible.
Yeah. And it's okay not to know the answers, right? And it's okay not to like have all the solutions. And it's okay to make mistakes. What's not okay is holding ourselves not responsible and accountable for those mistakes that we make along the way, or not acknowledging the mishaps that we may have in our dealings with our community members. And so I think that's a huge point too of what we're talking about and how the history of all of this came about and how we're showing up and how the institutions are showing up, and, the transparency, not only within ourselves, but within our institutions, in being able to say, okay, like, we don't have all the solutions, but we do know that there's been some afflictions, or there's been some missteps, or there's been some mistakes, or there's been some outright like disregard for folks. And let's hold one another accountable and responsible. And more than importantly, like, hold yourself accountable and responsible. And I think that's how we move to make those pods bigger and bigger and bigger, to be where everybody is having the say so, their opinion, their thoughts, their experiences, all of that being relevant to the conversation and ultimately to the development of what we're trying to create in a healthy and safe community.
Right. I think often when someone identifies as an abolitionist, the first question that comes up is, well, then what do you do instead of police and prisons? And I like to look at abolition as like a consistently evolving framework. Abolition is just kind of like the humility of acknowledging that the system that we have is not working, and we may not have all of the answers, but we know that what we need is more care. And that can look different in different situations, but specifically in thinking about disability justice, I was really moved by what you were saying, Ra, how, folks might not even identify with having a disability or being disabled because of all of the stigma. So I like to envision a world in which we all have like more compassion for ourselves, and we have more compassion for one another, and we can, say without shame, like, I'm disabled and, in this way. But, to go back to your definition of disabled, that just means that you deviate from the quote unquote norm. It's not inherently, a bad thing. It's just, as society, we have certain norms that are established. And if you have a deviation, either physically or, mentally, or your learning style, it means that you have a disability, and that's okay. We're all different. And, I think abolition like really calls us to being more empathetic and, not just wanting to punish people or, try and, I don't know, like, shame them out of their differences, but really abolition invites us all to embrace differences, to make accommodations on an individual or on a systemic level for folks with differing, mental and physical abilities. Yeah, I don't know. I would like to see us get there eventually, but I know that it's going to take a lot of work. Like, we've been so socialized to be judgmental, to see things that deviate from the norm as inherently negative things. I just think disability justice is, we've got to change policy and all the things and put different mechanisms in place to care for folks. But I really think it also has a lot to do with us, like, reframing how we see disability, how we see ourselves, how we see folks around us.
Yeah, and acknowledging that we all benefit from these tools. When people who are not directly impacted by the carceral system hear about abolishing prisons, they don't necessarily automatically feel like they'll benefit from it. And they feel like it'll cost more than give. And I think, like, during this pandemic, we've seen the entire world benefit from things that disability advocates fought for, Zooms and captions and ways to communicate from home and ways to communicate with sound, podcasting equipment. So much of this stuff sources from people who can't leave their house for whatever reason, or can't function in the world in a way that's beneficial to them or the world around them necessarily. Yeah, given the opportunity, these things help a lot of people. Like, I need captions to follow along if there's multiple people. The strokes have seen to that, and so do other neurological differences I have. But a lot of people just find it easier to follow along with captions. There's not like a dramatic reason for it. It's just, it's nice to see the word on the screen.
That's me. I'm people.
Yeah. So, I mean, these accessibility tools are really for all of us, and letting go of these things is for all of us. And just being aware of like the things that we accept because it's towards disabled people. Like on an off podcast conversation, we talked about Prop 17 and voting rights, and how one of the few exclusions is people who were found unfit by a court. Right. And it just feels really normal, that just doesn't stand out as an absurd or unfair thing, because we're so accustomed to the court being like, this person shouldn't actually have rights, They're not the same as us. And it's just become so commonplace that it's hard to even, like, recognizing it is definitely the first step.
Yeah, there's a few of us who've been engaging in some like voter registration outreach. This podcast is recorded shortly before the September 14th recall election. And, we've been trying to get folks who are on parole, who are otherwise impacted by incarceration, to register to vote. And when we talk through the eligibility, we say, hey, as long as you're a U.S. citizen and a resident of California, 18 or older, and not found mentally incompetent by a court, you can vote. And every time, I explain it to people because it's the facts, and I'm just trying to give them like accurate information.
Right.
But it's like the words like stick in my throat every time I have to explain that to folks. And sometimes people just kind of look at me. But a couple folks have actually asked, like, well, what does that mean that I've been found mentally incompetent? And I'm like, that is a great question. Like, I really am curious, like, what is the criteria? At what point does the court decide that you are not mentally fit to exercise your right to vote in a democracy? The ways that like ableism are so like, I don't know, sometimes like really casual, like, just casually weaved throughout our policies and everything. But yeah, in doing that work around voting rights restoration, that is something that has consistently come up. Like, we do have to tell people, but if you've been found mentally incompetent by a court, you can't vote. And I don't know what that means, and I don't think this is right, but this is what the law says.
Being found mentally incompetent by the court is one of those things. Like, I mean, Britney Spears' case is all over the news and TV right now, but guardianship laws have been a major issue for the disability community for a long time. We've been talking about it for a long time. It goes so far back, like most of these things, because most of the time, to be found mentally unfit, it's someone in your life who says, I promise you, they aren't, And so for a long time, like, husbands were putting their wives in mental institutions because, they didn't want to have kids, or they wanted to have a job, or they had all these things that we considered just mentally unfit. And we've sort of like, moved away from allowing that, but not so much. It is still a possible process for someone who has more power and privilege than you to find you mentally unfit, because that's kind of how the system works. The better lawyers can go there and explain the reasons why you aren't. And if they make a compelling case to one judge, it's very hard to undo. It's kind of a tangle at that point. Yeah, it's just such a weird caveat. I mean, even when slavery ended, disabled Black Americans were totally just kept in their imprisonments, because the idea was like, what are they going to do if they're free? He doesn't have a leg. He doesn't have, he's autistic, she's blind. And so this person who at least is giving them a home, in air quotes, is a better place for them. So like even these massive liberations still excluded disabled people. And that's why these care systems that they have in place, that we have in place, are so valuable to the abolitionist movement, because they're built around non-policing, and they're built around, not being able to trust legislators, not being able to trust anything except your community first. Right.
I always feel like even just the silence that we just had right now is so important, right? Just to kind of sit with what we're talking about, and kind of how it like resonates from within. I think about like what Ra and you were just sharing, Taina, about, the different ways that we communicate now, and how we're being like cognizant of others in a different way. And, it goes back to what I was talking about, like self-reflection and, self-accountability. During this COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of folks that were suffering even more because of COVID, and it was a lot of the folks that were incarcerated, and they already have been either diagnosed by mental professionals as somebody that is either like schizophrenic, or they're chronic depression, or high anxiety, like all of these different aspects, and then to be like isolated and kept away from their family members and not told like the up-to-date like facts that were happening around them. And then we start to talk about like our nursing homes and how the folks in there were like they were the hardest hit through COVID because of the lack of like care that they had around them. And as I like start to think more and more about this, or I've thought about this in the past, it's like it's heavy. Like there's no way for me to describe it other than it's really heavy. It makes me thankful for what I do have, but it makes me a little bit upset and frustrated with myself that I'm not doing more. How much more can I just show up for my fellow human beings and making sure that they're like being properly cared for during this moment.
If I could shift the conversation a little bit, but something that's coming up for me as we're having this conversation are the ways that I feel that prisons and even like rehabilitative programming within prisons kind of like reinforces like the stigmas of disability. And I'd really like to hear, y'all's two experiences since you've been in prison. But as someone who is just like observing someone in prison and like kind of hearing from them, like the self-help groups that they were going through, a lot of the groups like really re-emphasize personal responsibility. So there's really not a lot of space to say, okay, well, maybe, I had PTSD, or maybe, I had trauma, or I had, a learning disability, and this is why I struggled in school, and this is why I made XYZ decision. I didn't have access to, certain supportive services, and this is why I made the choices that I did. I feel like in prisons, like you're just constantly told by the cops, by everybody around you, like that you're just a terrible human being who made bad decisions. And there's really not space to talk about like any conditions or any like physical, mental, emotional issues that may have, played a role in it. And I've even watched like so many folks come home and really struggle with reentry and like having like compassion for other folks in their lives, because they're just like, this idea of like grit is like really reinforced in prisons, in my opinion, which is like, well, you just need to get over it and you just need to move through it. You made this mistake. This is why you're in this situation, and just, move on. So yeah, I'd really like to hear like your thoughts on the different ways that being in prison like really reinforces ableism and takes away any space that you have to talk about having a disability.
I mean, at a basic level, even just how prisons work is most prisons are kind of self-sustaining. The people incarcerated are the ones who mow the lawn and pave the sidewalks and take care of the fires and EMT services and everything. And yet they are billion-dollar industries for various organizations. Even the non-private prisons obviously still create a lot of profit for other companies. And that's done through the workforce of the people inside, the slave labor of the people inside. And because of that, the very first thing they do is assess your physical abilities, your heart and your blood pressure and your size and all of that. So right from the get, there are benefits to just being able-bodied. Just being in the fire camp program makes you eligible for better credits and better options and things like that. And then having a disability that requires care requires like separation, isolation, and prison is a lonely experience. Even if you're in Gen Pop, it's a lonely experience even when you're surrounded by people. When you're closed up in a tiny room, it's even worse. So yeah, just on that level alone, it definitely encourages it. But I do agree there's a mentality too that kind of tries to destruct collective care as much as possible. And yeah, I don't really know. I don't have an answer or thought. It's just something that's so prevalent. Everything you were saying about like, get through it and whatnot. I'm like, this is all just sounds exactly like what I heard inside.
Yeah. No, we have this thing while we're inside, we call it the 10-year wall with folks that are incarcerated. And that's really what it is. It's almost like Kubler-Ross's, the 5 stages of grief, in the process that we go through inside. And folks hit the 10 years and most of the time, they either go one way or another. They develop the grit and they develop like the fortitude that they're going to survive this no matter what, or they go the opposite way and feel like, that the sky is falling and that everything is doomed and that, there's no like recourse for them to be able to get the care that is needed. And when we're talking about responsibility, it's ingrained in us. Like, we were wrong, our behaviors were wrong, the things that we were doing were wrong, and you are now being punished for your wrongness of being different or not conforming to the social norms and the systems that are kind of set up within the social norms of how you can interact with the folks that are around you. And so as I was going through like a bunch of this personal transformation and self-reflection, there was a missing element in there in the institution that I was in. And that was having like a community of care. And so we started developing them ourselves within IL tags. They're called inmate-led activity groups, I think is the acronym of what it's, or taught activity groups or something like that.
I think inmate leisure time.
And so we started creating
groups.
These spaces without staff to where we could like literally talk about these things that we were going through and how we were affected by our upbringings, by our role modeling, by our like socialization with the communities that we lived in. And, this would be a much deeper talk if we started to talk about all of the intersections of how folks of color grew up in their communities, or how folks of other like color, whether you're Hispanics, Latinx, whatever the case may be, of how you grew up in, the ghetto or the barrio or the suburbs, and how you were treated by your caretakers or your community members. And all of these things lend to the development and the maturation of who you are as a person based upon your experiences, right? And so we would talk about these things, and it isn't all like self-flagellation where we're beating ourselves up because we're bad people or we're wrong. We start to acknowledge how the things that are around us also contributed to the way that we thought and the way that we were treated, or how we treated other people, and how we interacted with other folks. And so the system, it doesn't, like, obviously it took me, it was me and a small group of people. It took us a lot of work to be able to go through administration, to be able to even develop these classes, to have the space to be able to do this. And they didn't necessarily support it or want it, but it was also the pendulum swinging where they added the R to the back end of CDC, right? And so we started like using their words or their definitions to our benefit, and talking about how important it was for rehabilitation, and how the board wanted you to be able to become SUFI masters of, your personal like life and experiences and your inner development. And so, it took a lot of work, and we were like basically, thrown into the deep end, not knowing how to swim through these psychological issues, and just trying to figure it out based upon the books that we were reading and the education that we was getting. But more than all that, we just kept it from a center. And what I mean by that is our soul and our hearts of developing that empathy and strengthening that empathy and developing grit and resiliency within that empathy, and love, and showing up for one another, and just giving folks the space to be able to kind of unpack it. And we didn't have all of the answers, and we still don't have all of the answers, but we did have the one answer, and that was giving people the ability to express their voices.
Right. And I think that's such an important thing that abolition tries to like dismantle is this like punishment centered narrative. Right now our punishment centered system says that the only thing that matters is personal responsibility. The only thing that matters is the choices that you made. And we don't talk about, the ecosystem and how like none of these things happen in a vacuum. So to be clear, like as abolitionists, we're not saying personal responsibility doesn't matter and you can make whatever terrible choices you want to make without any consequences. But what we're saying is that it's both, right? It's not either or, it's both and. And what the system's responsibility is to create conditions in which people aren't forced to make decisions that are harmful. We give as many opportunities as possible for people to be happy, for people to thrive and be healthy and make decisions that are not going to harm themselves or others around them. But of course, we're humans and we will still make mistakes, and some people will still continue to cause harm. And we talk about what those consequences are and what that accountability looks like. What we know for a fact is that throwing someone in a concrete cage for a certain amount of years and isolating them and, punishing their family and a community, that is not an effective way of preventing harm or, stopping harm from happening again. That is just an effective way to further debilitate people and entire communities. So, yeah, I think, we've just got it all wrong. We're not seeing folks for their full humanity and the different abilities that, physical, mental, emotional that they may have. We're just punishing folks right now. And when we talk about abolition, we mean like, okay, how do we shift towards care, compassion, empathy? How do we ensure that folks have support that they need? So it's kind of where I'm going with this right now is, this conversation has really helped me reflect on all of the different ways that, disability intersects into our punishment system. And, what abolition looks like is not seeing disability as something that needs to be punished or something that lowers your inherent value as a human. It's something that just really reveals how much we as a society need to grow and be more inclusive.
Education too. It's one of those things where just being aware of, and I know this goes hand in hand with ableism, people don't want to talk about their disabilities because they feel like they'll be judged or not welcome. I'm lucky. I work for IJ, so I could just say I can't follow along. I need captions, and people just turn the captions on. It was not that big of a deal. It wasn't a conversation. I didn't have to go to HR. It was like we're just gonna switch the captions on. We added it to our notes document. We made a change. I say I want to go to the office, and everyone just pods up, coordinates so that I can get on that elevator and get inside. And Michelle crawls under the desk to plug my laptop in. So it's a team effort. But a lot of people, don't want to ask because they aren't necessarily in an organization that would support that or value it, and it may end up leading to judgments and things along the lines. But because of that, you don't necessarily get the education of what it looks like. What does a disabled body need? It's hard. It's kind of a riddle for someone who is able-bodied. It's hard to imagine a world that isn't your world. It's hard to imagine a neurological landscape that isn't the one you were born with. And so without that communication, it's very difficult. I think of the little boy who was killed by police, Elijah, and his autism being basically the reason. They didn't understand what was happening. And obviously that plus the millions of problems with policing that lead to that sort of empowerment and but just like what would awareness of what it looks like have done to alleviate that situation? What would education do to alleviate these things, to make them non-issues, and how do we get that education?
Yeah, and that you sharing Elijah's story raw makes me think about a story that I really don't share too often about my brother. So my brother has a disability. He has a a condition that's similar to epilepsy, but it's not epilepsy. But he has seizures every so often, and they're unpredictable. Almost 2 years ago now, he had a seizure while he was driving. He crashed into a parked car, and when the police arrived on the scene, he was still, dealing with the after effects of his seizure, and they assumed that he was under the influence. And my brother is he's my little brother, so I still see him as a boy, but he's a man. My brother's a large man. He's dark skinned. And, so they perceived him as, drunk or as some kind of a threat. And they beat him up. They slammed his face into the concrete, and, he had like a huge, like abrasion on his face. And when I contacted the hospital and found out what happened, when they brought him to the hospital, they gave him some medication to basically induce a coma because they didn't know what was going on with him and just made all these assumptions about him as being, a man of color. And I'm just like, man, these systems failed us in so many ways. Like one, my brother wasn't supposed to be driving because of his condition, but he didn't have another way to get to work. So he was driving to work because that's what, it's the tough decisions that capitalism makes us make. The police, why are police people who show up at a scene, right, for a car accident? Like maybe someone else could have been there to provide more care. But of course, they're not trained to recognize signs of a seizure or anything. But even the hospital staff, they just listened to what the police told them, and they were like, okay, this person's under the influence. We're going to put him into a coma and figure out how to deal with this later. And then he ended up facing like criminal charges later on that we had to, navigate. And I'm just like, man, here is another example of like someone with a disability put in a tough situation in the first place. And then when they made, a decision to drive, which was probably not a safe decision, we're criminalized for the consequences of those actions. So yeah, that's just like one story and like to reflect like this bigger issue that we have is that we're just really failing to accommodate folks with disabilities in our society. Sorry, that felt like a rant, like a ramble, but I was just thinking about that one.
No, I think it's relevant, and it was sad. I think the silence was just a moment of sad.
Right, like, damn, that was rough. Things shouldn't have gone down that way.
No, not at any point in that story should it have continued that way. Oh man.
Yeah, and for me, like it was like just the like dealing with the stuff of like being embarrassed about it, or we talk about a little bit about like shame, and I know I'll probably butcher her quote, Brene Brown, but she said something along the lines like shame is like a fungus; it can only survive in the darkness, right? Till we bring these things to light, and we have like an empathetic ear or an understanding ear towards folks that are going through their issues, and just the only way to like get rid of it is not only to bring it to light, but to wash it over with like love and empathy and having that understanding with folks. And so when we talk about education, that's what it really is just continuing to like learn from one another, not only inner education, but higher education, bringing more awareness to the topic and to the conversation when we're having it with other folks. And when we see it, call it, to be able to name it and to not necessarily cast judgment on folks that are making the mistakes and not like super aware about what they're doing, but to have that conversation with them and talk to them about the impact and the harm that they're causing, not only individually, but systemically. And I think that's where IJ really kind of steps in and is looking for laws and bill changes is systemically. That's where this bigger machine is kind of operating from. And also the folks that are in that bigger machine, the assembly people, the senators, to be able to kind of educate and be able to speak out to them about how it personally affects folks and how it affects their community, and to educate and enlighten them, because they may be myopic in their own dealings with the laws, or, how this kind of fits into what is already established, and to be able to have that conversation with them to try to sway them, or at least to, make them aware of how it is impacting the folks. And there's other ways to operate within this system, that we don't need to, have this disability justice kind of manifesting and continuing to grow within our laws, within our system. So I think that's like hugely important. What we've been kind of talking about, what Rob mentioned about how IJ just stepped up and, through unclosed captions. It's not a big deal. Like, is the more people that we can get included in these topics and the development of our neighborhoods and our society, I think the better off we're going to be.
I would encourage folks to, to try and let go of a little bit of that shame. And if you have a physical disability, a mental disability, a mental illness of any form, do what you can to like step into that and be okay with that. Like personally, I'm feeling called to, talk about my depression a little bit more and ask for what I need a little bit more. Because some days I just don't want to talk to anyone. I just want a couple hours to just sit around and be sad. And that's just what I need at that moment. So I would encourage folks to step into that a little bit more at the self level, but also like bigger at the policy level. What can we be doing to encourage legislators to see folks with different abilities? We worked earlier this year on AB 292, which, among other things, would have made credit earning equal for people who couldn't go to fire camp because of, any physical impairments that they may have. And that part got amended out. The legislature didn't, want to deal with that. And I don't think they would see it that way, but that was totally ableist to not offer the same credit earning opportunities for people who physically may not be able to go to fire camp, but meet all the other eligibility requirements. So yeah, I would encourage us to be more kind to ourselves and encourage, anyone in a position of power to be more aware and make brave decisions to include folks with disabilities.
Yeah, so I guess, if we had to leave someone with a message, it would just be to just pay attention, look at the requirements of eligibility that leave out disabled people, look at the places you visit and think, how would this be different if sound hurt me, if light hurt me, if it hurt to walk upstairs? If I was in pain every second of every day, how different would this job be? And what could someone do to alleviate that even just a little bit? And what can we do to make an environment where people feel okay acknowledging that they are disabled and feel okay explaining it to the people around them so that that education can start to build? What can we do to learn from these disability advocates who have been fighting for so long and through every liberation have to uniquely lead their own fight because they're consistently left out? And, what can we do? What can we learn from that? What words can we pick up? What structures can we pick up? What responsibilities should we be holding on to? And how can we integrate that directly into our liberation and not forget it?
Thank you for listening to Abolition is for Everybody. If you want to continue to support this podcast and our work overall, you can donate to support Initiate Justice at initiatejustice.org/donate.
You've been listening to Abolition is for Everybody, sponsored by Initiate Justice. Be sure to follow us at abolitionis_ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for regular updates. To support, please rate and comment wherever you listen to your podcasts. Those 5-star ratings help other people find their way to us, so thank you. You can also join us at Abolition Corner on the 4th Tuesday of every month to further your exploration of abolition in a small group. To learn more, please visit initiatejustice.org/abolition-corner.